Alarming Increase of Depravity Among Animals by Walter Scott. Aetas parentum peior avis tulit, nos nequiores mox daturos proginem vitiosiorem. The hackneyed lines of the satirist which we have selected for our motto contain a truth which, however melancholy, is so generally admitted that, aiming at some novelty in our communications to the public, we would have disdained even to quote or allude to them, had the human species alone been concerned, but, on the contrary, would have left lamentations over the gradual deterioration of mankind to those slippered pantaloons whom time has spared to bear unwearied testimony to the virtues of former times and the degeneracy of the present. Accordingly, our present anecdotes will neither be found to refer to the parliamentary reports upon mendicity, nor to appeal to the learned magistrate Mr. Cahoon's essay on the police of the metropolis, who classes his offenders with as much regularity as a botanist his specimens, nor to invoke the genius of Mr. Owen to devise an impracticable remedy for an incurable disease. These are all matters with which the public ear has been crammed even to satiety, and it was only upon discovering that the ulcer was extending itself more widely than even our worst fears had anticipated that we thought of calling the attention of the public to some very novel phenomena from which it appears that the moral deterioration so generally lamented has not confined itself within the bounds of humanity, but is fast extending its influence to the lower orders of creation. It is no longer the vile biped man alone whose crimes against society and depredations on the property of others furnish food, in the absence of sieges, battles, and other more specious and magnificent exercises of violence, for the diurnal penman and the peruser of his lucubrations. But our very dogs and horses infringe the 8th commandment, and commit felony beyond the benefit of clergy. There are 2 melancholy instances of depravity in the newspapers of this month which we meant to have transferred to our chronicle of remarkable events, but thought them far too important to be passed over without a commentary. Shadwell Office. A man named Sargent, constable of St. George's in the East, made a complaint before the sitting magistrates against a horse for stealing hay. The constable said that the horse came regularly every night to the coach stands in St. George's and ate his bellyful, and would then gallop away. He defied the whole of the parish officers to apprehend him, for if they attempted to go near him while he was eating, he would up with his heels and kick at them, or run at them, and if they did not go out of the way, he would bite them. He therefore thought it best to state the case to the magistrates. One of the magistrates. Well, Mr. Constable, if you should be annoyed again by this body in the execution of your duty, you may apprehend him, if you can, and bring him before us to answer your complaints. Hatton Garden. A canine robber. Mrs. Knight and another lady gave information of being robbed by a dog in the following singular manner. She stated that as she and her sister were returning about 6 o'clock in the preceding evening from St. Pancras Church towards Battle Bridge, a hairy dog, resembling a drover's or shepherd's dog, unaccompanied by any person, jumped suddenly up from the roadside and, laying hold of the ridicule she had in her hand with his teeth, forcibly snatched it from her, and, crossing off the road, made his escape. Her ridicule contained a pound note, a sovereign, 18 shillings in silver, a silver thimble, a pair of silver spectacles, and several other articles. The constable stated that a dog answering the same description attacked a poor woman on Saturday near the veterinary college, and robbed her of a bundle containing 2 shirts, some handkerchiefs, and some other things, with which he ran away, and that the poor woman was so frightened it had nearly cost her her life. There were several other charges made against the same dog, which is supposed to have been trained up to the business, and that his master must be at some place not far distant. The officers undertook to be on the alert to apprehend this depredator, or else to shoot him. We repeat our lamentation. These are indeed melancholy instances of depravity in the lower orders. Here we find not only the dog, the natural protector of our property, commencing depredations upon it, but even the horse, the ᴠᚤ᚞ᚁ himself, totally degenerating from his natural innocence of character and conducting himself like an absolute Yahoo. A stern moralist may indeed observe that something of this kind might have been anticipated from the dog. His alliance with those nightly robbers, the fox and the wolf, prepared us for suspicion, and his loyalty to his chief, like that of an ancient Highlander or borderer, has been always deemed consistent with a certain negligence of the strict rules of property. Gilbertfield, that imp of fame, as he was christened by Burns, has already acknowledged and apologized for a degree of laxity of morals in this particular. See the last dying words of Bonnie Heck, a famous greyhound in the Shire of Fife. Now honesty was aye my drift, an innocent and harmless shift, a kailpot lid gently to lift, or army sneck. Shame for the chaffs, they're call that theft, quo Bonnie Heck. But whatever suspicions may have fallen on the dog, the conduct of the horse, until this unfortunate and public disclosure, had left his character untainted even by suspicion, nor could it possibly have been supposed that he could have wanted a halter for any other service than that of tying him to his stall. There might be, perhaps, here and there, a Highland pony, by the same way we had one of that kind ourselves, who could too well understand the mode of opening a country stable door, and pull the bobbin till the latch came up, with the intelligence of Red Riding Hood herself. Nay, who had even become so well acquainted with the more complicated mechanism of the lock of the corn chest that it was not found advisable to leave the key in it. But, as late antiquaries of the Gothic race seem disposed to question the title of the mountain Celt to the name of man, we may well deny the title of his stumped, shaggy, dwarfish pony to be called horse. At any rate, these acts of petty larceny, on the part of the dog or horse, can never be compared with the acts of street robbery imputed to the ill-advised quadrupeds whose misconduct has given occasion to this article. It frequently happens, however, that a glance at the annals of past ages diminishes our estimate of the atrocity of the present, and consoles those too nervous moralists who are shocked at the increased depravity of our own times. Without, therefore, attempting any plea for the padding attempts of the dog, or the arts of stouthrief and sorning committed by the horse in question, and that upon the pittance of hay belonging to a stand of hackney coachmen, in which he might therefore have been compared to a robber of the poor's box, without, we repeat, having the least intention of advocating so frail a cause, we proceed to report a few facts which have come to our knowledge, and may serve to show that, after all, such instances of felony are not without example in the animal kingdom. Indeed, a proverb current in the border countries, which says, "Some will hunt their dog where they darena gang themsell," seems to indicate that, although there were varieties of the canine species that might give themselves to discover and catch the encroaching thieves of a different tribe, yet there were others who assisted their masters in the same trade, and even excelled them in boldness and address. This, perhaps, may be elucidated in the sequel. The first instance we shall refer to occurred in the celebrated case of Murdiston and Miller, whose trial proved fatal to the bipeds accused and, as has been generally averred, to their four-footed aider and abettor. Although we are uncertain, at this distance of time, whether it was Lord Braxfield or Monboddo who was said to have passed sentence upon them, yet thus far we know to be the fact that the late Lord Melville, while at the Scottish bar, was advocate depute upon the occasion. Murdiston occupied a farm on the north bank of the Tweed, and nearly opposite the ancient baronial castle of Traquair. Miller, the other minion of the moon, lived with him as his shepherd, and they laboured in their vocation of sheep-stealing for years with unsuspected diligence and perseverance. While returning home with their stolen droves, they avoided, even in the night, the roads along the banks of the river, or those that descended to the valley through the adjoining glens. They chose rather to come along the ridge of mountains that separate the small river of Leithen from the Tweed. But even here there was sometimes danger, for the shepherds occasionally visit their flocks even before day, and often when Miller had driven his prey from a distance, and while he was yet miles from home and the weather gleam of the eastern hills began to be tinged with the brightening dawn, he has left them to the charge of his dog, and descended himself to the banks of the Leithen, off his way, that he might not be seen connected with their company. Yarrow, although between 3 and 4 miles from his master, would continue, with care and silence, to bring the sheep onward to the ground belonging to Murdiston's farm, where his master's appearance could be neither a matter of question nor surprise. Adjoining to the thatched farmhouse was one of those old square towers, or peel houses, whose picturesque ruins were then seen ornamenting the course of the river, as they had been placed alternately along the north and south bank, generally from 300 to 600 yards from it, sometimes on the shin and sometimes in the hollow of a hill. In the vault of this tower it was the practice of these men to conceal the sheep they had recently stolen, and while the rest of their people were absent on Sunday at the church, they used to employ themselves in cancelling with their knives the ear mark and impressing with a hot iron a large O upon the face that covered both sides of the animal's nose, for the purpose of obliterating the brand of the true owner. While his accomplices were so busied, Yarrow kept watch in the open air, and gave notice, without fail, by his barking, of the approach of those who were not of the fancy. That he might vary the scene of his depredations, Miller had one night crossed the Tweed and betaken himself to a wild farm among the mountains of Selkirkshire, and, as the shepherds have a wonderfully minute knowledge of localities, he found no difficulty in collecting part of a flock and bringing away what number he judged convenient. Sheep are very loath to descend a hill in the night time, and more so to cross a river. Miller, to keep as clear as possible of the haunts of men, on his return brought his drove over the shoulder of Wallace's Hill opposite, and intended to swim them across a pool in the river Tweed. But his prey, being taken from the most remote part of the farm, happened to be mostly old ewes, of all the kinds of sheep the most stubborn in their propensities. And all the exertions of a very active man, intimately acquainted with the habits of the animals, and assisted by the most sagacious dog probably ever known, were found inadequate to overcome the reluctance of the sheep to take the river. Miller continued to exert himself until the dawn of morning warned him that any further effort was inconsistent with his habitual caution. Still, he was unwilling to relinquish his booty, since, could he only get the sheep across the river, he was within little more than 1/4 of a mile from the old tower. He therefore left the future conduct of the enterprise, as he had often done before, to Yarrow, crossed the river himself, and went home, encouraging the dog by his voice while he was yet not too distant, so as to risk being heard by some early riser. The trustworthy dog paused not, nor slackened his exertions. The work was now all his own. Such had been his efforts, as he furiously and desperately drove in first one flank of the drove and then another, that 2 of the ewes were forced from the bank into the river and were drowned, as they could not regain their situations for the pressure of their companions. But he was finally unsuccessful, for he too knew the danger of being seen in the broad light of morning driving sheep where sheep should they be. The ewes were observed, in the course of the ensuing day, wending their weary way homeward, and half covered with a new keel, with which Miller had himself marked them in a small sheepfold in a lonely place on his way. Miller himself was astonished at the stubbornness of the sheep and the persevering energy of his dog, and he told the story to a respectable sheep farmer in prison while under sentence of death. Murdiston and Miller suffered death, and Yarrow was generally supposed to have suffered the same fate. Nay, his dying speech was cried through the streets of Edinburgh along with that of his master. But as we have heard of a person unexpectedly reprieved who had the pleasure of purchasing his own last speech, it is certain that Yarrow had an opportunity to have done the same if he had possessed such a taste or means to indulge it. This celebrated dog was purchased by a sheep farmer in the neighbourhood, but did not take kindly to honest courses, and, his master having apparently no work of a different capacity in which to engage him, he was remarked to show rather less sagacity than the ordinary shepherd's dog. The case of Miller, although curious, is not singular. A young gentleman of fortune and fashion, lately residing as a visitor in Edinburgh, was the master of a beautiful and accomplished spaniel bitch, which, in its way, was as much an adept in irregular appropriation as Yarrow himself, and had, in all probability, been, like him, educated to steal for the benefit of his master. It was some time ere his new master, who had bought the animal from a person who dealt in selling dogs, became aware of this irregularity of morals, and he was astonished and teased by the animal bringing home articles which he had picked up in an irregular manner. But when he perceived that the spaniel proceeded upon system, he used to amuse his friends by causing her to give proofs of her sagacity in the Spartan art of privately stealing, putting, of course, the shopkeepers where he meant she should exercise her faculty on guard as to the issue. The process was curious, and excites some surprise at the pains which must have been bestowed to qualify the animal for these practices. So soon as the master entered a shop, the dog seemed to avoid all appearance of recognizing or acknowledging any connection with him, but lounged about with an indolent, disengaged, and independent sort of manner, as if she had come into the shop of her own accord. In the course of looking over some wares, his master indicated, by a touch on the parcel and a look towards the spaniel, that which he desired she should appropriate, and then left the shop. The dog, whose watchful eye caught the hint in an instant, instead of following his master out of the shop, continued to sit at the door or lie by the fire or watch the counter until she observed the attention of the people of the shop withdrawn from the prize which she wished to secure. Whenever she saw an opportunity of doing so unobserved, she never failed to jump upon the counter with her 4 feet, possess herself of the gloves, or whatever else had been pointed out to her, and escape from the shop to join her master. It is easy to conceive for what purposes this animal's sagacity had been thus perverted, but it would be difficult to form a probable guess at the particular method of training her to this mode of peculation. We knew well a gentleman in the profession of the law, to which his worth and honour rendered him an ornament, who used to give an account of an embarrassing accident which befell him on a journey to London, and which may serve as a corollary to our tale of the spaniel. In this gentleman's youth, probably between the 1750 and 1760, the journey betwixt Edinburgh and London was usually performed on horseback. The traveller might either ride post, or, if willing to travel more economically, he bought a horse and sold him at the end of his journey. The gentleman of whom we speak, who was a good judge of horses as well as a good horseman, had chosen the latter mode of travelling, and had sold the horse on which he rode from Scotland so soon as he arrived in London. With a view to his return, he went to Smithfield to purchase a horse the evening before he set out northwards. About dusk, a handsome horse was offered to him at so cheap a rate that he was led to suspect the animal to be unsound. As he could, however, discover no blemish, and as the seller, eager, for reasons well known to himself, to conclude a hasty bargain, readily abated even his first moderate demand, our traveller became the purchaser of a horse in which his skill could discern no blemish at a very cheap rate. On the next morning he set out on his journey. His horse had excellent paces, and the first few miles, while the road was well frequented, our traveller spent in congratulating himself on his good fortune. On Finchley Common, and at a place where the road run down one slight ascent and up another, the traveller met a clergyman driving a 1-horse chaise. There was nobody within sight, and the horse, by his manoeuvre, plainly intimated what had been the profession of his first master. Instead of passing the 1-horse chaise, he led his counter close up to it and stopped it, having no doubt that his rider would take so fair an opportunity of exercising his vocation. The clergyman, under the same mistake, produced his purse unasked, and assured the inoffensive and surprised horseman that it was unnecessary to draw his pistol. The traveller rallied his horse, with apologies to the venerable member of the church whom he had unwillingly affrighted, and pursued his journey. The horse next made the same suspicious approach to a coach, from the windows of which a blunderbuss was levelled, with denunciations of death and destruction to our countrymen, though sackless, as he expressed it, of all offence in deed or word. In a word, after his life had been once or twice endangered by the suspicions to which his horse's conduct gave rise, and his liberty as often threatened by peace officers who were disposed to apprehend him as the notorious highwayman who had formerly ridden the horse in question, he found himself obliged to part with the inauspicious animal for a mere trifle, and to purchase, at a pretty dear rate, a horse of less external figure and action, but of better moral habits. Thus have we, in some measure, paralleled the remarkable circumstances which seemed at first so startling to credibility. We sincerely hope, however, that these symptoms of flagrant immorality will not extend themselves among the lower tribes of creation. We are now on our guard, and may suspect malice prepense in other instances. All remember the dog of Islington and his master. The dog and man at first were friends, but when a pique began, the dog, to gain some private ends, went mad and bit the man. The case of a fall from a horse has been generally imputed to chance medley, but if the modern Houyhnhnms so far degenerate from those of Captain Gulliver, may we not justly find a bill for murder on the same specias facti? If these things are to proceed unchecked, we may hear of a cow picking a milkmaid's pockets, or of a horse stopping the mail coach instead of stopping with it. We still hope, however, better things of the quadrupeds of this realm, and trust that animals, which have hitherto, in the article of theft, been more sinned against than sinners, will not take generally to these practices, of which they have as yet only been the passive subjects. Tweedside, 30th September.